So, welcome, Daniel Simpson, to Keelan Yoga once again. Thanks for coming on. It's wonderful to see you once again.
Thanks for inviting me back, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So, Daniel's got a course out, The Roots of Modern Yoga, the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. I highly recommend it, having read Daniel's book and recommending it to all my students and trainees. It's a super good book called The Truth of Yoga. And if it's anything like this book, then I really would recommend that you check this new course out, because the roots of modern yoga are very interesting, because what we find pre-20th century is really a very different beast, as it were, to what we're seeing today in the modern yoga centers and what we're actually doing and what we think we're doing ourselves. As you might know from your own studies or from listening to me interview people like James Mallinson and the like, modern yoga scholars, we see pre-20th century and going back to the classical roots of yoga, something very different involving kind of penances and asceticism, latterly yoga use in kind of a very esoteric tantric manner in terms of raising kundalini through the body, which maybe we're doing a little bit more of that, but we're certainly probably not using yoga as a form of penance anymore. And we're probably not expecting.
I don't know.
That's actually very true, Daniel. Very, very true. Well, maybe, yes, I'll modify that. We actually probably are using yoga quite often to beat ourselves up, but maybe we shouldn't be. Anyways, so without further ado, there's this bridge between, let's say, the yoga pre-20th century and around, obviously, the obvious date is probably Swami Vivekananda, 1896 or whenever it was, that he comes over and speaks to the Chicago World Convention on Religions. And around this time, big things shift anyway, and in terms of the way that we're introduced to yoga, because prior to that, we don't really have that much connection, I think, in the West to the ancient tradition of yoga as it was. And there's certain kind of bridges that kind of moderate our experience, and I think probably set the tone subsequently, set the modern tone to yoga. So without further ado, would you perhaps, Daniel, just give a basic overview as to important dates and what we see happening and from when it started, and I'll jump in there if I have anything to say.
Well, yeah, all these things are very difficult to pin down. Specifically in terms of what we think of as modern yoga practice, we're often thinking of groups of people coming together on mats to go through a sequence of postures. And the earliest available evidence of people doing that, that certainly that I know of, is in India, outside Bombay in 1918 on Christmas Day, Versova Beach with Yogendra. The first modern yoga class, effectively, is barely more than 100 years old. Winding back a bit, as you say, Vivekananda coming to Chicago in 1893, that's a particular pivot point as well, in that sort of introduces the idea of yoga in a new and very accessible way to lots of people, as he hung around for a few years and ended up writing his book in 1896, Raja Yoga, which I think gives the sort of blueprint really for the way that a lot of modern teachers engage with philosophy. It's basically to remix traditional texts to say what we would like them to say, to support our own ideas. So Vivekananda was promoting Advaita Vedanta through the prism of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras to his Western students. But he'd also absorbed from these Western students lots of interesting ideas, particularly around, the sort of occult roots of what we would now call New Age thinking. So things that might be classified more technically as New Thought, mesmerism, and other funky ideas that could also be mapped onto ancient Indian ideas about prana being the sort of substrate out of which all life emerges, and so on and so forth. So we perhaps have to rewind a bit further to the foundation of the Theosophical Society in New York, and soon afterwards relocating to India, and this East-West exchange you start to see is already going backwards and forwards long before we get to people in the late 20th century involved in mass industrial yoga. So I think even before that, the first Westerner who claimed he was a yogi, or at least put it down in writing, was Henry David Thoreau. And that's, I think if I remember rightly, it's mid-19th century. And he was only doing that really because he'd heard about ideas related to yoga from the Bhagavad Gita that was translated in 1785 and spread quite quickly to the West and was a source of fascination, partly because it seems to mirror to a certain extent ideas about Christianity and salvation through the personal God. But also, there was an otherness to it, and it was clearly speaking about something experiential that chimed with early 19th century transcendentalism in the West, and that was really how Thoreau got interested in it, and Emerson, I think, was the first to promote it in the US. So lots of crossovers, basically.
When Vivekananda first comes, actually, obviously the date I got wrong, at the 1893, he comes across to speak at the World Parliament. Did he change his tune? Originally, when he came across, obviously he was saying that his guru was Ramakrishna, and that he'd already had some influence on him at that point, right? What we call neo-Hinduism, right? He'd already kind of changed the classical teachings even before he became influenced by modern transcendentalism or mesmerism and various other things that influences in the West, right?
I mean, he has, I guess, a range of influences on him. He grew up in Calcutta, which at that time was the capital of colonial British India. He was exposed to education in the English language and therefore to a lot of Western thinking. And at the same time, he did have this relationship with Ramakrishna. But Ramakrishna was a devotee of Kali and pretty out there. And those aren't really the sort of ideas that Vivekananda emphasizes, as you point out. I mean, he's very much influenced by a reform movement that grows up in 19th century Bengal, really in response to colonial occupation. And this is, the sort of big spectre hanging over the transition of yoga into a more sort of mainstream practice, more accessible to ordinary people who live in the world, is that fact of the colonial occupation of India. And in response to condescension from British officials, to the banning of wandering itinerant yogis, to ideas that physical yoga was some sort of cross between begging, charlatanry, and something like devil worship, Vivekananda and others were, I guess, trying to present Hinduism as really the apex of rational thought as well as mystical insight, and therefore compatible also even with science. So, this could be this was what the Westerners were looking for, effectively, direct experience. And religion all over the world eventually gets privatized in a way, turned into an experiential process, because that's the only way it can withstand the gaze of science, which obviously wants to measure everything and says, well, where's this bearded chap in the clouds you're all talking about? So I think he really built a bridge between the Western world of people who were interested in doing that and the Eastern world interested in doing that. And yoga became part of that discourse. And obviously yoga is primarily interested in direct experience. So it's really at the apex then of what the trendiest people thinking about, the most sort of esoteric and at the same time most important questions are all interested in. So he really sort of shows how this Eastern kind of, almost underground philosophy could be as mainstream as you like. And I think from that point onwards, the building blocks are there for when physical practices come to the West being more popular. Western teachers to pick this up and run with it and translate these ideas in their own way to sound, as relevant as they could possibly be to 60s counterculture, to, I don't know, sort of 1990s yoga boom philosophy, feel good in the body type stuff. And all the time feeling like we're still, in sync with the original tradition, even though all of those ideas are an enormous evolution, even from the point that Vivekananda was at in the late 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, I'm often kind of intrigued as to who kind of innovated the most, and I think certainly Vivekananda is up there as a huge kind of leapfrog between older ideas and newer iterations of what we're doing now, and particularly this idea that you mentioned previously of the discrepancy between the teachings we find in Patanjali of Sankhya Yoga, which is a dualistic philosophy, and saying that there's a God and a person, and really never the two can meet, and right, and you probably won't, and even if we read, well, we don't know Patanjali exactly. Anyway, this is another conversation, but whether he believed in liberation in the world or not, generally speaking, liberation wasn't happening in the world. That came kind of later in Indian philosophy, and then with Vivekananda, we find Advaita Vedanta, everything is now. You are already there. There's no barrier between you and the divine experience. And obviously, this is a much more positive and kind of feel good kind of thing that we'd like to hear, right? But where does this come from?
This phrase self-realization is really something that he popularizes, and it comes really from the enormous capacity of the Hindu religion, although Hinduism is only a relatively recent label that's been attached to these traditions, that just incredibly capable of absorbing additional influences, even things that are directly opposed to the original founding core of that religion. Often, yoga really emerged as a challenge to the ideas of the Vedic ritual, and yet within a few centuries, yoga teachings and the teachings of Brahmin priests easily combined back together again. And so I think with Vivekananda and this Neo-Vedanta strain in 19th century India, there's this attempt really to, sort of always collapse everything back into the all-encompassing oneness that can contain everything, whatever it might be. So whether there's distinction in the form of, worshipping different gods in an Indian context, all of that can be explained under the sort of bigger umbrella of everything is one. These are just different ways into the oneness. And then when coming to the Western world, there is this idea that even your religion, it's possible to see it in this way. In fact, this is the universal blueprint for resolving conflict between world religions. And so Vivekananda is a fascinating character in that way, because he's speaking the same language as the theosophists in the Western context, who are trying to find the perennial philosophy, the secret behind everything that everybody can tap into, and find the sort of master key to global mysticism. And that's, I think, this sort of combustible influence that really ignites a lot of what happens from that point onwards in the West. But the thing that Vivekananda wasn't promoting is physical yoga practice. He was, in fact, very rude about it and said it was a waste of time, wouldn't get you anywhere. He did teach a little bit of it because his Western students started asking about practices, but that wasn't his field of innovation. His was more about ideas. When it comes to physical practices, I mean, we can't really get away from the influence of Krishnamacharya and, his best-known students, particularly Iyengar and Jois, just because they systematized two things that are now the building blocks of modern classes: the focus on where to put bits of your body in great detail and with lots of precision, the whole concept of alignment cues coming out of Iyengar's version of things, and the idea of dynamic sequencing flow, which is the main system of yoga taught in gyms, yoga studios all over the world. That comes out of the Ashtanga approach. Both of which traceable back to Krishnamacharya. Of course, there are other aspects to Krishnamacharya's teaching through others of his students, not least his son Desikachar, which don't get quite the same attention, but are also equally innovative. The idea of yoga therapy really systematized in a much more holistic way through that tradition, although obviously it was pioneered by others in India, and their influence didn't quite spread abroad in the same way. So there's that strand. Yeah. But then there are others. I mean, we could make a case for the influence of, he's not a popular character for good reason, because he's a criminal, basically. But Bikram comes out of another lineage of really innovative physical practice in Calcutta in the early 20th century.
And bodybuilding,
and the fusion there between bodybuilding and yoga practice was something that was, these days everybody's got this sort of, I guess in response to Mark Singleton's book, Yoga Body, an aversion quite often to hearing about this connection between yogic practice and non-yogic systems of exercise. But this was totally uncontroversial in early 20th century India. Many yoga teachers were, very enthusiastically mixing and matching from these different traditions, understanding that, physical training was good to strengthen the body, but yogic, pursuits were about something subtler than that. But they could still work with the body towards the subtlety. And the popularization of sun salutations is really a fusion of yoga and bodybuilding. Krishnamacharya, who, although he likes to sort of say everything he did was traditional, was openly accused by Kuvalayananda, who's one of his rivals, I suppose, in 1930s India, of mixing yoga with non-yogic systems of exercise when he went to give a demonstration of fancy asana. And was told, in fact, don't teach this stuff to adults. That's really only for teenagers. And obviously these guys were just a little bit slagging each other off. But there was a widespread acceptance of that. Kuvalayananda did the same thing. He was originally a martial artist, and although he then promoted yoga, science, medicalization, healing through the body, he was mixing and matching himself. So this enormous creativity, I think, and blurring of the boundaries. And this is the point that Yoga Body makes that everybody overlooks, is that there isn't something mutually exclusive about physical exercise and spiritual attainment. And in fact, in the early 20th century, the two were seen as entirely compatible. It's just that obviously the aim is to see beyond attachment to the body. And in a modern context, often, all that sort of physical hard work gets people much more invested in how they look, posing and whatnot. But the idea there was that the two could be mutually sort of beneficial, complementary.
Well, that's a pretty reasonable whistle-stop tour through a number of aspects and characters of the 20th century modern yoga scene. What about, you missed out Sri Yogendra there. And I think unfortunately, I say unfortunately, but he seems to be a figure that still lurks in the shadows, really, right? I mean, he's not much talked about, and yet he had a huge influence. I mean, he really was the first modern yoga teacher, wasn't he? You mentioned the class given on Christmas Day in Mumbai.
Well, exactly,
and he's the first person to open general classes. Yeah.
He had a very, traditional guru. He and Kuvalayananda, another pioneering figure, they had the same teacher. And this guy, in a traditional ashram context, was using various aspects of physical yoga as medical treatments, effectively, to heal people's ailments. And both of the other two, Kuvalayananda and Yogendra, wished to sort of carry that on in the world with ordinary people rather than in an ashram context. And Yogendra was basically being groomed by his teacher to take over. And he renouncing effectively and said, I dedicate myself to life in the world. So he was consciously not wanting to be a guru, speaking openly about the challenges of earning a living really as a yoga teacher, and patron initially, but eventually was trying to charge a fair price for people to come and get yoga teachings, pioneering therefore a drop-in class model effectively. But even the format of modern yoga classes, starting by sitting in a relaxed position and then ending lying down in shavasana. We don't know of anybody else before him who was putting that together as a framework. And he was very interested in the sort of relaxation dimension of yoga. He got a lot of those ideas, actually, though, from a Western source, from Genevieve Stebbins, 19th century New York, dancer, performer to a certain extent, but really synthesizing ideas that which she called harmonic gymnastics, and combining that with a focus on breathwork. So all these other systems of integrating mind, body, and spirit that existed in the West independently of India start to get combined with yoga. And Yogendra he went to the US like Vivekananda in, I think, 1920 or so. He taught for a little while. Wasn't in the end all that impressed with the US, but he learned a lot there, probably picked up some of those ideas, came back to India, really sort of clear in his mission to, bring yoga to the masses. And in the end, he felt a bit upstaged by his, guru Bhai, his fellow devotee of his teacher.
Well, he did have a bit of paranoia there, didn't he? Yeah.
Well, he did to a certain extent, but
I think it was unjustified.
He spins it. He was supposed to get the ashram space that Kuvalayananda got in Lonavala. Whether that's true or not, we have no idea. But he had a bitterness that's sort of stable.
Yes,
and Yogendra, he does seem like a worldly guy.
As
you say, he's bitter, and also, at the same time, he's human. You couldn't mistake him for a guru on a pedestal. And I think that's quite a refreshing thing as well.
But it is, and he's incredible in what he has done for modern yoga, or depending on your viewpoint. I mean, because also you mentioned the breathing, right? What we call yoga breathing now is really, I think, his innovation. Right? There was previous to that, we obviously have a posture taken in generally a rigid form, like a static asana, and then more of a pranayama applied to whilst in this static asana. But Yogendra starts to move his asanas around. He develops a dynamic asana, as I understand, and he puts a certain breath with it. But I don't think that people were doing that pre-Yogendra. I think, right?
Well, I think this is the key to modern yoga in a way, that is, the connecting thread back to traditional practice, and all the main innovative teachers wind up doing something similar. I mean, this is how you get the idea that vinyasa means the synchronization of breath and movement with Krishnamacharya's teaching. It's a way to maintain, the two primary forms of the Mahabharata defines yoga as meditation and says there are two ways of going about it. One, you just focus your mind one pointedly, and the other is pranayama, because it just dissolves your mind eventually if you do enough of it. And the idea was we could have a little bit of the one pointed focus and a little bit of the, breath manipulation as part of asana practice. And that is 100% new, totally. Who invented it first? I really don't know. I don't know that anybody could actually pinpoint that, but it very quickly becomes the way of making what is effectively a dynamic calisthenics kind of practice something more than dynamic calisthenics, because it involves concentration and it involves, the manipulation of vital energy. And then bandhas are brought in, and even gazing points, etc., etc. But all of that is connecting something that is apparently quite new and apparently even quite gymnastic with something that's much older. Many of the shapes are quite old. Doesn't mean that all of them are new inventions, but a large number of them are relatively new, and certainly the sequences into which they were combined are new. And yet, at the same time, some of the oldest connections ever talked about in Indian texts are there. The mind and the breath connection discussed in the Chandogya Upanishad. So there's a real sort of attempt, I think, to ground innovation in tradition, and then in most cases to pretend no innovation has taken place. And coming back to your point about Yogendra, I think that's another refreshing thing about him. He was quite open about it. He was like, I'm going to do a new thing. I want to marry science and spirituality and life in the world and, all these different things. So,
yes, he was quite Western in lots of ways, wasn't he? Whereas someone like Krishnamacharya obviously believed innovation didn't happen because his guru was within him. So it was no innovation, because it was simply just, kind of like spewing out what was kind of coming from classical precedent, from the guru within, which is a good way to get around innovation.
Well, I guess he went even further. He claimed to be channeling dreams in which he was spoken to by an ancestor from 1,000 years ago, and faithfully representing a long lost text that had all the sequences written down in it, but unfortunately couldn't be produced.
The thing is, it might seem, and I know that many more traditional Indian commentators and even people listening to this in India and I probably get a lot of slack for it, and they'll say, why are you picking apart in a modern sense yoga? Right, it's a classical tradition, right? And and what's the reason for this critical theory applied to yoga? Right, what help does it make? So would you answer a defense of that?
Gladly, Adam. Yeah, I think there's again a bit of a misnomer. It's a bit like the idea that somehow exercise and spiritual attainment are, pulling in opposite directions rather than something that can be harnessed together. Critical thinking is compatible with yoga. It's not the enemy of yoga. And in fact, given a lot of the, accretion of power by people who claim to have all the answers, while at the same time often telling tall stories, is something that is thankfully being eroded a little bit these days. Doesn't mean we need to do away with the idea that yoga is something that comes from ancient Indian tradition, first of all. We also don't need to do away with the idea that the highest aspirations of yoga are worth striving for. And sometimes in the scholarly world, that just isn't discussed. So all the analysis can sound quite dry, as if there's no point going about it. But most of the people producing it are also practitioners and do have an investment in it, even if they don't talk about it. And then the third thing, really, I think, is that it helps us to understand better what we're doing. It's not to say that, you're going to get the best guidance on how to practice yoga from reading academic analysis. But a little bit of critical thinking can help us become a little bit clearer about what's the most important stuff to prioritize. And also, especially in this age where people are concerned about cultural appropriation, decolonization, and attempts to preserve some connection to tradition, it's a lot more helpful to know what actually is traditional rather than what's being invented and then disguised as tradition. Because then we actually get a bit clearer about how we're playing a part in this process. We're all innovating, whether we like it or not, because we're alive and possessed of a certain amount of free will, even if it doesn't enable us to control very much. So we're making choices, and the choices we make will shape what yoga becomes. So the clearer we are about the connecting threads that do run through all of that change that keep some continuity alive, the easier it will be for us to carry on the process, hand on the baton to the next generation with at least some of the traditional elements preserved, rather than just telling ourselves, oh, it's all the same thing and we've done a good job. And this is why I like to get sort of into some of the specifics that people are saying about yoga. So often these days you'll hear yoga means union. It comes from Patanjali, and it's all about chakras and kundalini. Those three things, all from different places, have only relatively recently been combined and tend to mislead us. They take us into this idea that there's only one yoga tradition. There is, in our own body and sort of engagement with practice, the one thing that we're doing. But the combination of ingredients that make that up is, an enormously shape-shifting thing just in our own practice experience. So imagine how it's been over hundreds of years, thousands of years of lots of different people doing the same thing, all sorts of mixing and matching going on. And the clearer we are about the fact that that's even happened, the better positioned we'll be to think, sensibly about what we're prioritizing and why. And that really leads me into the idea that yoga philosophy is it's a living thing. Conversations like the ones you have are important. They seed the idea that, we're developing our own philosophy of yoga. It doesn't mean that the other texts that have been written before are irrelevant. It's just that they don't have all the answers to life in the 21st century when conditions and priorities are different. So we're choosing what to prioritize, and it's more helpful to admit that that's what we're doing than pretending that Patanjali says all the stuff that we want to do. So I guess that's why I think the scholarly analysis helps to free us up from the idea that it's wrong to reinvent things. Because the problem with that is we end up reinventing them and then pretending all the old texts say the reinvented things.
Yeah. I mean, so many great points there, Daniel. And it is a subject that really intrigues me. Can we decide anything that's efficient, and useful in terms of our happiness now? Can we just call that yoga? For example, what about yoga therapy, right? Does yoga inherently have to be something to do with the transcendental aspiration for meaning outside life? Or can we simply, as many people do now, and, fair enough, use it for physical healing, right? Use it for physical healing, use it for mental and emotional healing, use it for a little bit of respite in life, right? And can we call that yoga? Can we sit with a goat on our back and say, the obvious one, and say, well, that's our intention to what makes us feel good in life, and yoga is about feeling good in life, and that is our modern version of yoga, right? Or is there some line in the sand where we have to say there has to be a precedent somewhere along the line, in terms of our intention to what we're doing, and that has to be the same as what it was there?
I think you sum it up very well in that last statement, Adam. I think we have to, I guess, have some connection to other things that have been called yoga in the past to really be able to defend the choice to call what we do now yoga. If there's no connection of any kind whatsoever, why are we using this word? Especially if we've actually consciously chosen to reject all of those things. Otherwise, it's probably just yoga for branding. And, some of the things you see now, rage yoga, drunk yoga,
rage yoga, that's great.
Basically, I get together, sort of, sometimes get really drunk, start swearing and shouting, vent your anger. It's probably quite helpful to vent your anger. And I suppose you could then make an argument for that might diminish suffering in some way, and that somehow has a connection to yoga. Well, I guess the thing I really want to say is I'm not the yoga police. I'm not going to go around and tell anybody else where that line is, but I think it's something we need to think about for ourselves. If we want to use the word yoga, we should, I think, have a simple answer for ourselves. What is yoga? And also then, by extension, what isn't? What is it about what we're doing that is yoga?
Just break in there and say one thing. I think when I've done this and people have challenged it and say, well, that's really useful. And you're saying that that's not yoga. And it's like, well, no, the two things are different. Yoga therapy, for example, right? Using asana as a therapeutic tool for healing the body, for example, right? That's weird. It doesn't invalidate that and the importance of that modality by saying maybe that's not yoga. It's like, well, I think it's, that's a kind of important point to make is that these things that we're bringing in now, and we're using kind of certain principles for, that they're not invalid just because they don't happen to have the same precedent as classical yoga.
Well, I hear you, and that is an interesting distinction to make. And I guess the question really is how we define healing. And in traditional contexts in yoga, it's liberation from the cycle of birth, really. But the underlying sort of sentiment behind that is freedom from cycles of suffering and conditioned experience that causes suffering. So in the end, it's basically freedom from the idea of being a person was the fundamental aim for original yogis. And that function is still, very relevant. In this enormously self-centered world that we inhabit these days, even just loosening the attachment to the idea of ourselves just a little bit is great source of empowerment. So I think if all connection to the idea that, at some level the problem is me has been lost, then it's gone a bit far away from yoga tradition. If it's just about trying to get more comfortable in our little safe space, it just means blissing out in our personal bubble and not really understanding the interconnection of things, and also the fact that getting out of our comfort zone is part of what that process of changing our perspective on reality was all about. And yet at the same time, relief of suffering, if we're not going all the way to sort of completely detach from being a person and detach from reality as we know it, and perhaps even from, living in the world, then, we've lowered the bar a little bit. And perhaps that also then can quite legitimately encompass getting more comfortable in a body that's afflicted by pain due to whatever chronic disease, for example. Being able to be better capable of facing death is again a very traditional element of yoga philosophy. That's really what Patanjali, I guess, is talking about to a certain extent. Get ready to die and maybe even go all the way. But obviously people have to face death. We can't avoid it. It's coming for all of us. And if yoga makes people more comfortably embodied as they have to deal with the slow decay of the body, then perhaps that is traditional. It's very hard to say. I think every criterion gets pretty slippery. I've even managed to rationalize rage yoga briefly in a moment. We're passing over it. So as I say, I think it's an open question that we can keep exploring, because if there's one thing that yoga has consistently been, it's an inquiry. Even if that inquiry involves shutting down all of the sense doors and just looking inwards, and really not going in with preconceptions, actually trying to remove all mental content to see what's behind. And so just even inquiring into the question of what is yoga and accepting that we don't have a fixed answer, that maybe there isn't a fixed answer, is already, I guess, in keeping with the spirit of that tradition, I think. And really also just being open to the fact that everything is changing. That is the reality of life in the world. And so, all of these answers we might have about what's yoga is bound, they're bound to be in flux. The yoga tradition, though, does suggest that there is something that's unchanging, this sort of true self, or pure consciousness that stands outside of that. Katha Upanishad says, find that which doesn't change amidst all the other things that do. But maybe the thing that's unchanging in some ways is the function of yoga. The form of yoga is constantly changing, but the underlying function we can perhaps find some continuity with, even if it just keeps shape-shifting from relief from the cycle of births to being a little bit more comfortable in a pain-afflicted body. Perhaps there is a thread of continuity there in that function of alleviating suffering. But I think the question we really have to keep coming back to is we shouldn't be just trying to alleviate our own suffering to get more comfortable being me in my little container. It's much more about dissolving that, which inevitably leads us more in the way of, the Mahayana Buddhist bodhisattva of trying to remove suffering in general, which is where people can latch on to all sorts of political ideas as well, which I don't think are necessarily yoga in themselves. But I do think it could be yoga to talk about politics. The last session of this online course, The Roots of Modern Yoga, looks at how yoga and politics have been combined. I mean, Gandhi made a whole political philosophy out of Patanjali's first two yamas plus a few other ideas. So there is this idea that yoga is actually compatible with almost anything, but I don't think yoga is in and of itself everything.
Yeah.
Although it is about our relationship with everything, so you could say it is.
I mean, that's the thing. I think, we can define or redefine the use of what the alleviation of suffering means, right? Or what, right? But seems to me still we have to have certain kind of criterion around that, and I probably would suggest a higher aspiration than simply, as you say, comfort in one's own small bubble in the world, to call it yoga. Do we have any precedent for what we're currently doing? Is there any precedent in scriptures to the current that gives some kind of context and lead to the current yoga that you mentioned flow yoga, or right, different iterations we see in the current yoga class situation. Where does this come from?
Well, I mean, all of that really is 20th century invention. It's a derivation from Krishnamacharya and his idea of dynamic sequenced asana, which was probably for demonstration purposes initially, and also perhaps for training young men that he was tasked to whip into shape. But I think, it does come perhaps from a broader tradition. He was obviously drawing ideas from somewhere, Krishnamacharya, and I think the influence of wrestling training, other perhaps Indian martial arts, perhaps even traditions of dance, on the development of dynamic sequenced asana is just something that's understudied, that we know very little about. So there are precedents there. There's one text that's now the focus of a lot of scholarly interest, that is perhaps the first evidence of sequenced postures from the 18th century. The Hatha Yoga Pradipika was probably studied in a slightly adapted form by Krishnamacharya, and may have given him the sanction to come up with his own inventions. But there really isn't a precedent for sequenced asana being the practice until the 20th century. There isn't even really a precedent for what you're talking about, the idea of health and well-being as the objective of yoga until the 20th century. But some of those teachers we've been talking about, I mean, all of them to a certain extent, Krishnamacharya, Yogendra, Kuvalayananda, talked about yoga being for that purpose. They also held out the prospect of something higher than that. So in a way, it's almost a hierarchy of needs. You go back to Abraham Maslow and his pyramid. So you could have sort of entry-level yoga just being more comfortably embodied, and sort of top of the pyramid, going up in a blaze of light out the top of the head like the old yogis. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that any of it's any less yoga just because there's a hierarchy even. It's more just aligned with yoga. And all of these things, I think, are on a spectrum. And part of yoga philosophy, in fact, often is seeing the polarity and realizing that the two extremes aren't really where anybody is. In fact, we're all somewhere on that spectrum. And again, it's a moving thing. So to take a really simple example, Patanjali says practice is a balance of, basically making an effort to concentrate and letting go and becoming totally absorbed. So how can you both, pull in one way and the other way at the same time? Well, you do. You find this dynamic balance of those two things. He was talking about, pure seated meditation, but you can do that in physical asana practice. Is then doing that inauthentic because it's now adapted to a different context? Or is it just, again, thinking about the usefulness of ideas, and the broader question, I think, of why is the one that really needs the most consideration. The what we're doing is less important, I think. It's why we're doing it, and to a certain extent how we're doing it, that yoga philosophy is really addressing. And we can, I think, find continuities, but it's always on the spectrum, perhaps not going as far as one could take it. One could perhaps push things a little bit further, and and also, why not? It'd be great. It'd be great to think there's always further to go with these practices, at the same time as, realizing perhaps we don't need to go anywhere at all. perhaps we can actually find some element of yoga right here, right now, without doing anything. And yet still there's a point to the practice. So it's this weird combination of aiming for something while at the same time there being nothing worth aiming for other than being right here, right now. It's a tricky one. Yoga's full of paradox would be my answer.
What about the Hatha Yoga Pradipika as a text that seems to convey some use of asana for the sake of health, or at least keeping the body healthy for meditation? So would you say there's some roots there?
That's a very good point, Adam. Yeah, I mean, that's the text that first really identifies non-seated postures as something that we might do for physical benefits. For example, Mayurasana, the peacock posture, arm balance, challenging one, can't hold it for very long, was the first non-seated posture to be taught in a yoga text around 1,000 years ago. And it was introduced as one of the lowest, so it didn't seem to have any benefits at all to the guys who wrote those texts. But it then very quickly, by the time of the Hatha Pradipika, a few hundred years later, is said to cure all diseases, have all of these wonderful benefits for your digestion. And obviously it did. But I think it tells us something about the function of asana at the same time as well. All of these positions are in some way cleansing things out to be capable of sitting and doing the next stage of practice, which is pranayama. There's no suggestion that once you've, as it puts it towards the end of the first chapter of the Hatha Pradipika, become firm and steady in your practice of asana and bandha, there's no need to do any training any longer. You're then capable of doing the main practice, which is pranayama and mudra. And then to a certain extent, there are some meditations in the fourth chapter. But the repetition of mudra seems to be the practice that the yogi's aiming for. And that is a bit like asana. It's making a physical shape, but holding it for a very long time with holding the breath involved, with the locks engaged, moving energies around. And it's said you're supposed to practice these mudras 8 times a day, so every 3 hours. So quite when you eat or sleep without, engaging the locks and holding everything up there. I don't really know. But I think the role of asana is therefore entirely as a warm-up, as you suggest. And that's the distinction in modern yoga. It's become an end in itself, and the mechanism through which everything else can be explored, as Iyengar put it. And there just is no precedent for that. That is the definition of modern yoga. That's what Mark Singleton and his PhD supervisor, Elizabeth de Michaelis, were in their different ways discussing. That's the essence of modern postural yoga, making postures the entirety of the practice in a way, or the suggestion that through that you can get a long way with yoga. And in some ways you can. I mean, concentration really is the essence of yoga as a practice. And you can concentrate on anything. Patanjali points that out, 39th Sutra of the first, the Samadhi Pada. He says, that's really up to you to find what you fix your mind on. So why not fix your mind on making shapes? But the Hatha Pradipika says nothing of that. It just says, do these things for a while, cleanse yourself out, and then move on to pranayama. And if you're still not quite cleansed out, do the shat karmas as another way of, getting rid of all the goo and gunk that clogs up your nadis.
I think, you touched on a good point that concentration really is the kind of nub of it, or that, the kind of turning center, isn't it? But again, that being so ambiguous could then really be interpreted in any way you want. And then anything could once again be yoga, really, if you concentrate.
That's a very good point.
It begs the question then about intention. Right? If your concentration is intent on truth, or your concentration is intent on something else. But then, even then, we see, you mentioned briefly, I think, on it uses in yoga in medieval times as a kind of sorcery, as a kind of concentration in order to kind of get magic powers, right? And then is that yoga, right? And it kind of brings me on to the kind of question I'd like to ask you is, where does we see a discrepancy between now, where yoga is purely for being a better person in the world, being my best self, right? But previous to that, we have a lot of yoga which is a little bit more insidious and darker, to do with developing personal power, generally over others, right? And how does maybe the role of politics or Hindu nationalism tie into this at all? Does the politicization? I know it's a bit of a complicated issue, but it seems it seems to tie into this this revamping of yoga from something which was sometimes somewhat more of a sorcery kind of practice.
There are elements of that, in the yoga tradition. I mean, the pursuit of powers has been, airbrushed out of yoga history a lot of the time in the modern world. I mean, how many yoga teacher trainings read the third pada of the Yoga Sutra, which is all about powers? There's more sutras on magic powers than anything else in the Yoga Sutra.
You see this, and you see the nath sadhus practicing yoga in a way, or acting in such a manner that doesn't suggest ahimsa particularly.
Well, there's certainly not any of this prioritization of what we like to think of as yoga often in the yoga tradition. Right. I was teaching a training last week talking about asceticism and doing really tough body mortification, effectively holding your arm up until it turns into a redundant piece of wood. And some guy put up his hand and said, "This seems to me an early example of toxic masculinity." And I could see where it was coming from. But I think in a way that there is that sort of bifurcation, the two possibilities in yoga between trying to just get liberated from the world effectively, or to be more empowered to be in the world. And both of those things have been associated with yoga. But I think traditionally, if we really go back to it and look at what practices are, I guess, allied with the cultivation of powers, there's a lot more tapas, a lot more asceticism going on amongst those early practitioners. And then with the injection of tantra, you get sort of almost the acceleration of that process and the possibility of combining powers and liberation. So there's a lot more interest in that. The tantric traditions are what influence physical practice, so that's where you really get the combination of the two. But none of the Hatha Yoga texts really talk about that. They do say, some of them, that you can become liberated in this body and become like a god and walk around the world doing whatever you like, including sleeping with whoever you feel like and summoning down, all these divine kind of beings to consort with you while you live forever. But for the most part, they really are talking still about liberation. And I think there's a slightly purer yoga focus on turning away from the world. And that's not to say that texts like Patanjali's is not giving a lot of space to powers, because it is. But in the end, Patanjali does say powers are one thing, and you can also get them through concentration. He lists 5 options: drugs, chanting mantras, being lucky, or I've forgotten which ones I've said. The practice of austerities, as well as the meditation that he teaches. All of those will work. But in the end, he says, you've got to let go even of the omnipotence and omniscience of being a god if you want to get liberated. So there was always that idea before Tantra came along and said powers and liberation can be the same thing, which did turbocharge some of these traditions like the Naths. But in the end, I think, we are, I think, encouraged by early yoga texts to not be self-centered. If there's one consistent message, it's to see beyond the illusion of me. However that's framed or phrased, whether it's just to go beyond the mind, where the whole idea of me originates, or whether it's explicitly to deal with the problem of desire, as a lot of yoga texts talk about. This attachment to self-satisfaction is the problem. That's what causes misery and keeps us engaged in action. So the attempts these days to make yoga about living my best life are perhaps less connected to tradition than sometimes is suggested. I'm not sure that yoga necessarily makes you a better person, unless you choose to be a better person. Might make you very good at concentrating, becoming absorbed in all sorts of otherworldly states. But then when you come back in the world, you might behave like a, insert swear word of choice. But I think the basic message is to try and decrease your self-centeredness and therefore your tendency towards bad behavior. Some would argue that anybody who comes back from their ability to meditate very deeply and hasn't transformed themselves hasn't really gone as far as the tradition is encouraging you to go. So although there is the possibility of gaining power, it's never really meant to be power over others. It's really power over the idea of yourself to eliminate it. That's the real power. That's the ultimate power, is to just be content with everything the way it is and not need the world to revolve around us to provide us all the things that we think we need to be happy. So Patanjali says actually that in the commentary accompanying the sutra on the benefits of contentment, the niyama of santosha, says it's basically equivalent to 16 times the best attainments from all the love in the world, so better than the best sex, and also 16 times better than being in heaven with all the gods. That's really, in some ways, that's the ultimate power, just to be okay with everything as it is, the same thing as the Buddha talks about. So building up back to the question of politics, I mean, I think inherently trying to have power over other people has got very little to do with yoga. And the use of yoga by politicians in modern India is therefore something that we, I think, would benefit from having a little bit of a skeptical look at. Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, went to the United Nations in 2014. I mean, this is all part of my course, so I'll get it out
Okay, right.
And he asked the United Nations to endorse this International Day of Yoga, to be held on June 21st, summer solstice every year. June 21st also happens to be the death anniversary of the founder of the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the sort of voluntary nationalist movement, which Modi joined as a young man, and was also modelled on some of the weirder movements of European fascism. And that has been part of the current project, in a way, is to reposition Modi, to sort of distance him from those things that are being said about him. He was banned from travelling to the US. He tried to get a visa in 2005 and was told he couldn't go there. And then within 10 years, he's in front of the UN General Assembly in New York, making a speech saying, let's have World Yoga Day. So it was a masterstroke of diplomatic soft power to align himself with all of this. And at the same time, that's probably quite sincere to a certain extent. I mean, he has an association with yoga that seems to be part of his daily lifestyle. So I'm not trying to suggest he's cynically manipulated yoga entirely, but there's definitely some opportunism at work in that push for International Yoga Day. And I think also then the way in which it helps to reinforce certain narratives that help Hindu nationalism, particularly about everything being really old and all coming from the ancient Indus Valley and perhaps even way back when, before we've even imagined history going to. So all of that helps with the idea that India is the repository of all sacred knowledge, one. Number two, that it's a country that is synonymous with Hindus, which is the essence of Hindu nationalism, this idea of Hindutva. The nation is indistinguishable from the Hindus as a race rather than as a religion. And that, is aligned with some of the hardline politicians who are, really basically inciting violence against minorities, particularly Muslims. And then obviously this has all got another side to it, because there have been terrorist attacks in India. There have been wars with the neighbour Pakistan since partition. There are problems that, these nationalists feed off in the same way that the leaders of the Western world who invaded Iraq without any justification whatsoever in 2003 fed off the existence of global Islamic terrorism and the attacks on New York and Washington in 2001. They didn't, we'll end up down a conspiracy rabbit hole if we don't watch out, but opportunism is something that goes on everywhere in politics, is what I'm really trying to say. And yoga is not immune from that. And the problem sometimes becomes that in the modern world, when we're encouraged to think about decolonizing yoga, centering voices from the place where yoga originated, we might inadvertently, therefore, co-opt a few Hindu nationalist narratives without realizing it. And I think this obsession with everything being old in order to be authentic makes that even more likely, particularly because that's one of the particular arguments that's being pushed from that worldview. So I think we just, would do well to be aware of that. And some might say me as a white man talking about yoga history is already overstepping some boundaries. I guess what I think matters more than anything
else. It's been said in the comments of many videos.
Trying to be accurate. That's all we can do. Try to be accurate. And part of being accurate for me is to be honest about the history of Western colonialism. And the course looks at that in great detail, as well as also seeing some of the effects of that, which is the understandable rise of nationalism. That's how the British were kicked out of India in the first place. But that has now got a life of its own in modern India. And I think we need to be aware of the ways in which that creeps into the yoga space, especially as we're increasingly interested in centering voices from the Indian subcontinent when listening to ideas about yoga philosophy and the meaning of what we're doing.
Well put, Daniel, and I'll probably kind of make 5 less comments that I'll have to answer than on this video. Maybe it's been days kind of getting back to these, because it is a very contentious issue, which is understandably so. But everything has a political dimension, because we're social beings, and Patanjali wasn't talking to social beings, and that's the thing. We've taken Patanjali's text, which was a monastic text, and we've used it. We use particularly the yamas and somewhat the niyamas for everyday life, and as a way to translate our experience in society rather than out of society. And I think this is so yoga inevitably plays a part in this, and yoga sprung. I mean, Krishnamacharya was obviously tasked by the Maharaja of Mysore to make something where which Maharaja of Mysore was very much involved in the nationalist discourse of making, not in a necessarily negative way, but making, India great and proud again, and reasonably so, and so Krishnamacharya is making these strong young boys, rooted in somewhat of an Indian discipline. So, it's, not all at all for the negative, let's say.
Absolutely not. There would be There would be no modern yoga practice in the way that we know it were it not for those forces. That's what really encouraged people to think about cultivating the body in an indigenous way. There was this prevalence of global systems of exercise through the colonial occupation of India. Some of those ideas were helpful, but in the end, what really inspired these innovators was the idea that we have an indigenous tradition of working with the body in India that is actually aspiring to something more than just body cultivation. But we can use some of this body cultivation mentality to make it really relevant and really powerful to urban householders who can drop in, get a little bit of it, and make it part of their daily routine. And so that's it's a really, really important function.
All right, finally, Daniel, where do you see it? I mean, it's a leading question, but where do you see yoga, innovating? Where do you see it innovating to the future? Look at current yoga and the way it's, it's a billion-dollar industry or whatever it is. It's become an industry, and it's commercialized and commoditized, etc., etc. And where would you like to see it going, and what are the pitfalls that we might be aware of, in terms of just going down a complete dark alley with it, blind alley with it?
Well, I think the thing I would like to see, and I keep sort of hoping we're almost there, is that it sounds a bit sort of doom mongering, but the bursting of the yoga bubble to a certain extent. There's been this sort of upward trajectory, this yoga boom with the engine of capitalist transformation of yoga into this commoditized product available on every street corner. Really always being in turbo accelerate mode. And even with the pandemic shutting down yoga studios, the technology that's allowing us to talk has also enabled yoga to be transmitted ever more quickly to ever more places all at once. So there's this engine of growth there. It would be nice to see as well the sort of parallel realization that yoga's not really about all of those things. Yoga's a way in which we relate to ourselves first and foremost, and perhaps to see beyond this idea of ourselves, and then to go back into the world perhaps as slightly less what can we say, afflicted being, and that's what yoga's about, and that's not often promoted in these contexts. The ideas might be paid lip service to, practices are taught, people get benefits from practices, sometimes they lead in that direction. There's an encouragement from all the yoga texts, if anybody opens them, to go in that direction. But what's often amplified by the current model is mastery of techniques, rather than why are we doing this, and what are those techniques actually supposed to achieve. You can get really good at concentrating and still choose to fire a weapon more effectively, or trade all manner of complicated financial instruments and collapse the world economy. So there's all sorts of things you can do with a concentrated mind, not all of them necessarily noble. And so I think encouraging more internalization would be a good thing, and that would happen if there were fewer yoga businesses still in business. And unfortunately, that's been happening of late, places closing down. So I'm not trying to say I want to see the yoga industry to collapse. I work in it, obviously. I'm part of it.
Job. Yeah, exactly.
It's nice to go into spaces and talk to people. But what I'm always struck by when I go into a modern yoga studio is how little space is created for what we're doing here, talking about yoga. In India, if you were to say, I'm giving a yoga workshop, often people would expect you were going to sit on the stage and give a discourse rather than teach them how to move one part of their body slightly more skillfully for half an hour, and then sit down and watch a demonstration of how to do the next thing. So I think this idea of talking about yoga is important, because it then gives us a space to stop talking and turn away from the talking. So I'd like to see a bit more of that coming in, and I don't think that's compatible with the capitalistic, fill the room with as many people as possible mindset in most yoga studios. That's really what I'm talking about. The impetus towards making money, which is essential if you're going to keep the studio open, is sort of leading away from the focus on what's most important, and instead it's just who's got the best soundtrack, who can be the most inspiring Mr. Motivator at the front of the room, and it's not necessarily got anything to do with yoga, although it can. There are some teachers who do a wonderful job of managing to push themselves through those hoops and still preserve some of what's yoga, but obviously they're the minority, and the vast majority of what's out there with the word yoga attached to it isn't that well connected to yoga tradition. And if there was a shift in that kind of market dynamic, a lot of that would fall away. It would be the next thing that, would be the thing that would be replaced by the next trend, much as yoga replaced aerobics and jogging as something that was trendy for a while in the 80s. So I don't know. It's exciting in some ways to see what might happen, especially now. The access to quality information about yoga history and philosophy is unparalleled. You can read all the texts, you can listen to all the teachers, you can tune into podcasts and hear them being interviewed. And so there's a possibility for something new to come out of all of that. And I don't know what it looks like. The dark side, though, you're asking about, obviously technology is getting more and more involved. The dark side for me, and it's a sort of thought experiment that I think I once heard Mark Singleton talking about, what if you could just push a button once we've got closer to the singularity and there's a chip in the forehead and goodness knows what else, you just push a button on your device or think the right thought and suddenly, boom, the mind is still, concentration attained without any willpower behind it. Would that still be yoga? That's obviously a fairly extreme thought experiment, but somewhere between here and there, there'd be many ways in which the simulation of yogic attainment is ever more accessible to people through technology. And it will become even more likely that the real meaning of yoga gets sort of distorted or falls away through the capacity to access what people think they're trying to get from yoga without actually having to do any of the disciplined, let's face it, even semi-sacrificial hard work. I mean, if nothing else, sacrificing attachment to the need for everything to be a certain way in order to be content in that. If any of that isn't required, what's that got to do with the yoga tradition? And I see the possibility of technology delivering all sorts of things. You've already got these weird necklaces that can give you vibrations and help you to meditate, or just at the very least chill you out.
That sounds interesting.
Right. Yeah. So and then there's going to be headsets that can monitor your thought waves and tell you how to
back to the
get
start.
better,
I suppose
better
yoga was originally synonymous with tapas, really. So it's doing something that's hard, and I think we've kind of lost the realization that's important, right? Like I remember, in the kind of very early philosophy classes, I think, when I was still studying it at secondary school, when I say, well, if you could just take a pill that would make you happy, would you take it? That kind of thing, So it's part of which is kind of what you're saying in a way, with a chip in the head. It's like, is there anything that is relevant about struggle and something to do with yoga is, as you say, it's in the right manner, safely challenging one's own limitations, if we want to do anything kind of substantial, is important. And I think the danger for me is that, on one hand, I tread this very finely, this fence between, making people comfortable in the class, which is fundamental, and in current discourse, this idea of yoga and the importance of yoga in trauma therapy and, presenting a safe space for people in the class, and the yoga teacher is not some kind of crazy wisdom guru who's going to break people out of their their comfort zone. But on the other hand, we can easily run the risk as well of wrapping people up in such cotton wool in the yoga class now that there's no possibility of coming into oneself in a difficult and challenging manner, where one might then have some kind of general kind of and progressive transformation.
It's a really interesting point to make, Adam, and I think it's a really important one to emphasise. There is. I've seen you talking about this quite a bit on social media, the role of the teacher, and what one needs to bear in mind, and it is really important that teachers reflect on that. And sometimes I wonder whether we as teachers really need to do much more than seed the idea that this is a concept for people to find their own relationship with. Obviously, it's hard to see out of your own comfort zone. If it was easy, then we wouldn't need any help. But perhaps it's not the teacher's job to do the prodding as much as to sow the seed of the fact that we need to challenge ourselves. We need to watch out for this desire to be comfortable all the time, and that's where people get into cold baths and Wim Hof training and goodness knows what, and all that's got some that is tapas in action in the 21st century. So we don't have to do it that way. There are other ways of doing it, but actually willfully embracing something beyond the comfort zone can be transformative. There's a lot of ways we can choose to go about that, and it's up to us to find one that works for us without at the same time trying to get too comfortable in our attempt to go beyond discomfort, because otherwise we'll just reinforce the same tendency. But yoga, Patanjali talks about tapas as essential because it burns through impurity. And without trying to turn yoga into Christian doctrine on original sin and we're all stained or anything, suffering is the product of what goes on between the ears. We build unhelpful patterns into our mind. A lot of them we inherited from other people, generations back, passed through the previous generation to us, built around us by society in ever more complex ways through mass media and electronic devices in our hands at all times. Somehow we have to unwind some of that. Some work has to be done. And this sort of discipline of being willing to confront the fact that that exists and being able to burn through some of it somehow. That's what tapas is. It's heat. It's this transformative power of the original sacrificial fire. And the idea is to offer up into it all of the unhelpful stuff that we carry around with us all the time. And we need to find a way of doing that, or I don't think it's really yoga in the end. So I've gone there, I've said it, that if yoga hasn't got some of that in it, it's probably not yoga, in my opinion.
Finally,
but, who am I? I'm just
some definition.
I'm just some guy. It's up to you.
Well, that's a good place to end it, Daniel. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a wonderful chat. And please look up the course that Daniel's teaching. I'm kind of tempted myself to sign up. And if you haven't read the book, The Truth of Yoga is a fantastic book. I'm putting my utter endorsement behind that. You'll find Daniel's website in the comments and in the everywhere where to reach him and what he's doing. So thanks again, Daniel, for your time today. It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much, Adam. No, I really appreciate it. It'd be lovely to have you on the course. And really, just to sort of emphasize, part of the course is almost you get another book. I've really sort of written the sequel to The Truth of Yoga as the course notes.
Okay.
So bonus.
Right. That's tempting. Okay. Thanks, Daniel.
Well, thanks again. Take care.